So I'm going to play a clip from my friend's channel, Missing Mod. So check out her channel, Missing Mod, on YouTube. I go on there sometimes and have really interesting discussions because apparently people are scared to come on my channel. But I have the good interactions on her channel, so I really appreciate that because that's why I do this. But because of all the burnt nuts out there who say things that are false about you and spread rumors and say things you don't actually believe that your church teaches and misrepresent you, it scares people away who could benefit from learning things that people lie to them about. Unfortunately, that's my opinion. That's just laying it all out. Which, by the way, only makes me more sure that I'm in the right place. So if you have a real concern about what I believe, because you actually know what I believe, if you were a Christian, you would be very careful not to misrepresent what I believe. But since you don't, it just tells me you are being willfully ignorant. And it's only through honest and careful dialogue as a Christian that you're going to change anybody's mind. You might gather a bunch of mob that keeps people ignorant and belligerent towards others for false reasons, and you might glory in that, but you're not doing what Christ commanded when you do that. And people who don't do that and operate properly is where I get my pleasure and enjoyment from and what I'm seeking to do. And I think because I've, from experience, learned that that's what we're supposed to do. And that's what Christ said. If you disagree, let me know. Maybe I'm being arrogant by saying I recognize that and I want to encourage that in other people. Maybe I'm arrogant. Maybe it's arrogant to tell atheists they have to believe in Christ to go to heaven and live forever. Maybe that's arrogant too. But I'm pretty sure of it. And so I'm going to preach that. That's what I think. And I think a lot of people ought to come around to my way of looking at that regarding honesty, charity, and operating as a Christian. Now, that being said, so I want to play this, and this is why I want to play this. This is interesting because Adventists are small p partial preterists. In other words, we don't deny what a lot of futurists do, that is application to things Jesus said, etc., to the destruction of Jerusalem in the first century. And we agree with preterists that the 70th week of Daniel is passed because everybody did before preterism was invented. So I do think preterism is very dangerously wrong about what it is that we're looking forward to and what it means for God to be all in all and for sin to be destroyed and the devil to be destroyed, and what that looks like and what God is restoring of what was lost is all totally distorted by preterism. But what was interesting is preterists seem to be more studied and intelligent than other Christians. And so on one hand, it does concern me that if I'm too agreeable with a preterist, it'll make people who are ignorant not be careful thinkers and think, oh, look how this Adventist agrees with this preterist on so much. So I want to make it clear to the get-go. I'm not really interested in beating people up for being heretics if they're not belligerent. When they're belligerent, it makes me a worse person. So don't misunderstand the things I agree with this person on as endorsing their view. I think it's very dangerous to not understand what the blessed hope is, what a restoration looks like, all the things I just mentioned. So that being said, I do think this is a good example of, at least maybe not from the very beginning, my attitude may not have been as good as it could have been, but how interaction should go. I'm also interested in showing this because to my brethren who agree with what I'm talking about here, I want their insights regarding how to approach showing how this preterist is wrong, because this preterist agrees, and as my understanding is, not that I'm very studied on it, that maybe this is getting more popular with preterists or something, but what is hell? What is heaven? Because they think the second coming already happened and the resurrection from the dead already happened. But this preterist is affirming that the resurrection is not, that is spoken about in the New Testament that's future, was that which happened in Matthew 27. This preterist thinks hell is just death and you no longer exist when you died now because of their preterism. They believe that when you die, you get your spiritual body at death if you're a believer and you go to heaven forever. In other words, the new heavens and the new earth are now, but this preterist believes, like Adventists do, that death is how we describe, except for when you die now as a believer, you go to heaven and get a spiritual body. But he believes before the cross, when you die, essentially our view is right in the Old Testament. That's what the Bible is describing. But then after the cross, Christ gets people out of Abraham's bosom by conquering death, and so he takes them out of there. You get what I'm saying? So he agrees, like soul sleep, quote unquote, soul sleep is true before the cross. You're just dead and gone. And that makes they're being honest with the Old Testament passages that clearly teach this. But they say, and then he also believes that hell was just describing the destruction of Jerusalem. All the Bible verses are just talking about that. Revelation, etc. We're leading up to the first century and it's over. The only difference is some nuanced things, which are only nuanced different regarding what Paul says about the gathering together to Jesus, the nature of the bodies, all that stuff is very similar. They just think now when you die, you're taken to heaven. But if you die and you're not saved, you just stay dead. So how to approach this? Because I'm going to have a conversation with this guy. So let me play it, and that's kind of explaining the agreements we end up having here and how to approach this with this non-standard preterism that believes many things that we understand to be true. Now, brethren, so believers, so it's a Christian context, believers in Messiah, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him, we ask you not to be shaken in mind or troubled, either by spirit or by word or by letters, as if from us, the apostles, as though the day of Christ had come. If anybody tells you that, so the context here is that people are telling him the day of the Lord is past, which is a concept from the Old Testament. And it's confusing, right? Because some of it's applies to Jesus' first coming, but he's saying, look, the day of the Lord hasn't come yet. And he says, don't let anybody fool you or think that we said otherwise. Because let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come until the falling away comes first and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that's called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. So in other words, Jesus isn't coming back for the saints until the man of sin, who hasn't been revealed yet, is revealed. And so it can't happen until at least that much happens first. And then the person he's speaking of, almost any scholar from any point of view will tell you that's a reference to the little horn of Daniel 7, the fourth kingdom from Daniel's time, which is Rome in some form or another. So
yeah, and it was Titus, the man of sin. And if you look at Revelation 17:10, it says there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, 1 is. If you start with Julius Caesar, you count to the 5 that have fallen, you get to the 1 that is. That's Nero. He was alive when Revelation was written. And then the 3 little horns, or not 3 little horns, there was 1 little horn, but the 3 horns that were plucked up would be Otho, Galba, and Vitellius. And then you get to Vespasian. And he sent his son Titus to Jerusalem in his name to conquer and destroy the temple. And Titus did, in fact, stand in the Holy of Holies, declaring himself to have killed God, as a matter of fact, being supreme to God, and was worshipped there by his soldiers.
Let's see. Give me a second, but I don't think that qualifies as the kingdoms, but let me get a verse to show why that is.
Please don't leave.
Yeah, so what is the apostasy then? The falling away.
No king but Caesar was the cry of the Jews when they crucified Christ. and that continued. That was their. They didn't have a king anymore. They were under Caesar's control.
That's not an apostasy from what's
You
been
don't think
established
so?
by Christ.
You don't
No,
think
because
that's
it's
an
what's
apostasy?
established by Christ that's an apostasy. The Jews before the new covenant.
So the Jews said they have no king but Caesar, and that's not a falling away of God's people.
Not after. No, this is in a context that is coming after this in historical context when Paul's saying
Right, but
this.
that continues.
The apostasy from here forward has to be after the time period when he's saying this in 2 Thessalonians, which is well after the new covenant's been established and Jesus has ascended. So you're like back. You're back. I mean, I'm trying.
No,
Let me try to
this
be fair.
continued. This adultery, this whoring about with Rome continued.
Yeah, but that's not an apostasy from faith in the Messiah, which is established, is what I'm saying. You're like backdating the apostasy, but the context given in 2 Thessalonians.
Oh, you think that Christians are going to fall away?
Well,
not
yeah,
the Jews.
The falling away has to come first. He's saying it hasn't happened yet. When he's saying it, which is after the new covenant's been established in time, like historically when he was writing, when this event would be occurring, in a chronology of history.
All right, where were you? 2 Thessalonians.
Thessalonians 2,
right? 2 Thessalonians 2. Okay, so that ye be not shaken in mind or be troubled, neither by spirit nor by word nor by letter as from us, as that the day of Christ is at hand. So he was saying it was already at hand. I mean, that's what John said.
As if it were. Don't believe as though it were already at hand. Because and then he explains why.
No, he's just saying, don't be shaken in mind.
Yeah, but keep reading.
Not even by letters from us. Don't be shaken. So do you think Paul's letters would have been scary? Of course.
First of all,
because
the day of
Christ
as a believer
is at
or
hand.
an unbeliever? I need a clarifying question before we move on. Are you saying? I need to see a few clarifiers before you go to the next thing. Are you saying? Are you coming at? Well, first, are you coming at this as a believer or not believer? I'm just curious.
Oh, I'm a believer.
Okay, so
I'm not coming at this in any kind of way though, because like I was actually about to leave. But
are you a full preterist then? So you don't think there's a literal physical resurrection in the future?
No, I believe the resurrection is ongoing. The physical resurrection happened at Christ's resurrections in Matthew 25 when the graves were opened up and the dead walked.
Matthew 27.
Jesus said, is it 27?
I think so.
It's 25.
25 is the three parables of the virgins and then the separating of the nations of when he returns in glory with his holy angels and all the, and in the parable of I forget the three parables of the 10 virgins, and then the last one is him coming with his holy angels, all the holy angels, and he separates.
I know exactly what happened. I said 25. It's actually 50. You're right. It's 27, verse 52. And sometimes I remember things backwards.
Oh yeah, I got you.
So 25:52. The graves were opened and many bodies of the saints which slept arose. That was a physical resurrection right there. And we have a spiritual ongoing resurrection. Paul also wrote that we were once dead in our transgressions, our trespasses and sins. We were made alive. We were quickened by the Spirit. So that's the spiritual resurrection that we go through. There's a spiritual death. There is a physical death that we also go through, but the resurrection, the spiritual resurrection that we have been awakened from the spiritual death is ongoing, and it's a past, present, and future fulfillment type of deal.
So I agree with you that like when you look at John 5, he kind of seems to be describing, like what Paul says, like people are walking around with dead spirits. Is what he means is they're not regenerated by Christ, and that happens now through the Holy Spirit. That's obviously a concept I see, and
that still happens. That happened to me.
Right, exactly. When you're a believer, right? So when you come to faith, and so also, I guess you're acknowledging that there's also a sense where Jesus raised Lazarus, and all after that in John 5, he kind of reiterates it and speaks of a literal sort of resurrection, where those who are in the graves will hear the voice and come forth, like Lazarus did. And so you're acknowledging that, okay? And so to that, I'll say, I actually find this funny and sad at the same time, but I'm a physicalist, so I'm an Adventist physicalist. So I think dead people aren't alive. So I don't even believe that people can be alive without a body, humans anyway. And so,
Right.
so the
I'll
sort
answer
of
that.
arguments that dualists give me against my position, which I feel is biblical, because of that misunderstanding that the majority believe, that opens the door to your view, in my opinion, right? So like, I kind of laugh when I see your average dualist Christian arguing with someone like you, and you're using that same argument they use against me, against them, to argue for your view. So it's funny, but sad to me at the same time.
Well, Paul answers, he says, but some men will say, how are the dead raised up, and with what body do they come? He answers, he says, thou fool, that which thou sowest is not quickened, except it die. And that which thou sowest not that the body, sowest not that body that shall be, but bear grain, it may chance of wheat or of some other grain. But God giveth it a body as it hath pleased him, and to every seed his own body. All flesh is not the same flesh, but there is one kind of flesh of men, another flesh of beasts, another flesh of fishes, and another of birds. There are also celestial bodies and bodies terrestrial, but the glory of the celestial is one, the glory of the terrestrial is another. Glory of the sun, there is one glory of the sun, and another glory of the moon, and another glory of the stars, for one star differeth from another in glory. So also is the resurrection of the dead. It is sown in corruption, it is raised in incorruption. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, that's this what we have now, but it is raised a spiritual body. There is a natural body, there is a spiritual body. So it is written, the first man, Adam, was made a living soul. The last man, Adam, was made a quickening spirit. So that's what our next body is going to be. It's going to be this spiritual body, this heavenly body. We have to die in the flesh before we can become what we're ultimately meant to be, and that's spiritual beings with spiritual bodies. We wouldn't be disembodied in a sense. We'll have different bodies. And Paul writes the comparison to the grain, because you sow a seed, it comes up as something different. You know,
totally.
still produces
I agree with most of
forth.
what you're saying. Where do you think Paul's getting his idea about the seed from?
Where do I think he's getting his idea about the
Do you
seed?
see that as being a new concept, or do you see that from something in the Old Testament?
Jesus also mentioned the parable of the sower as well. I mean, these were agricultural people as well. So it's a very common theme throughout Scripture, and it's just kind
Do you
of
agree though
understood
that do you agree
in their
when we
society.
define? Sorry, go ahead.
No, that was all I had to say.
Okay, sorry, I interrupted you. So I
At the
don't
very
disagree
end,
with
it's okay.
much of what you're saying. I don't disagree with what you're saying. I would just say there's so much you have to cross-reference here, but to try to be succinct,
yeah.
I would just say when you put all of Paul's teaching of the resurrection together, like the things about we shall be like him, and because we'll see him as he is, and the connection between just prior to what you're reading in 1 Corinthians 15, what does it say? It says Christ. So you're saying these things are fulfilled. Let me make 2 points. You're saying they're fulfilled before 70 AD, essentially, it seems. And so it says those that are Christ, when he puts all enemies under his feet, that would have to be when he destroys, has the Romans destroy the temple. And then we move into the new heavens and new earth period, which started after, when that was fully realized, Christ puts his enemies under his feet, which would be the Jews that rejected him, I assume. And then but it says that's when death is abolished. But when Christ, when it says those that are his at his coming, your interpretation would say his coming, to be charitable, I would guess it has to do with him from his birth, or at least his ministry starting through the end of the temple, would be kind of the whole period which you would describe as that was talking about. Yeah. And so but it's like at his coming
His
when
ministry
he
being the first 3.5 years, his
Mhm.
judgment being the second 3.5.
Okay, but the temple isn't destroyed until 40 years later. So when you want to
Right.
include that period,
Right.
that would
Well,
be his
I mean, 40
part of his coming,
years is
right?
also a common theme to be wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. Christ was tempted for 40 days. Uh, the number 40 has a lot of significance as well.
Right. And so that you probably interpret that as the millennial symbolism in Revelation 20, probably, right?
Well, you asked me if I was a full preterist earlier, and I didn't get the chance to answer. I'm actually a premillennial preterist.
Oh,
Or
so I'm a
what would be
partial
called.
preterist. Okay.
Okay.
So just to be clear, I
Understand.
believe the 78, I believe like
So
you do
you're
that.
post-mill,
Yes. And I
right?
believe I would just say I believe the 70th week is past, and I believe Jesus
Oh, absolutely.
that's a huge thing. And I agree when
Right.
people reject things. I was in a different mindset. I totally misspoke there. I'm not post-millennial. I'm premillennial. And I just didn't catch that because my mind was thinking through the implications of his views in light of particular doctrines that we were agreeing on, which is what's interesting about this for me. Because a lot of classical preterists, it seems to me anyways, have different ideas. So I normally, quote unquote, dismiss them in my mind for other reasons that I can't dismiss this person in certain doctrines that I think undermines preterism in general. But he doesn't have those views. So he's like a modified, and I would say a modified preterism. So I wish I wouldn't have said yes to the post-millennial thing. I was just like, my mind was going a certain direction and he interjected and I said, yeah, but what I meant was what I was thinking is I'm post-tribulation, pre-mill, but he said post-millennial. When I said I'm a partial preterist, I mean, I maybe shouldn't say that because apparently people associate that with all our post-millennialism, which is what I think he was thinking. And we're going to have a conversation, so maybe he'll watch this and hear this. So that's why I'm post-tribulation premillennial, but I'm not a futurist. I'm a historicist. Things preterists say regarding the use of language and metaphoric language has application to the first century. I just think we know too much about from the very earliest creeds of Christianity and the introduction of death into the narrative of the Bible as a whole is what I'd just to say it like as a whole here, that the thing that Jesus is abolishing is that which was lost through Adam, according to Paul, like in Romans 5. So the ultimate abolishment of death would be that which came into the world when man, disobeyed God or
spiritual death, because obviously Adam didn't die right away in that moment.
Yeah, but we understand that nobody died before Adam ate the fruit. They weren't going to die.
Right.
Physically.
No, absolutely. Sure.
And like you have to import there really is no, like when you look at the Hebrew, and this is what I get from scholars, I'm not one, but my understanding is that, and I've looked at it somewhat, and been told by scholars that are study the Hebrew that anyways, part of that's worth, that in the Old Testament, there really is any, in the text itself, a concept of spiritual death. I mean, I understand that theological ideas, I don't think that's totally out of bounds, but
yeah, they slept. Is what they
right.
said.
I'm
they
a physicalist, right? Yeah, right. So how do you look at that? Do you think in the old covenant before the cross, people were unconscious when they died?
Essentially, yeah.
Okay. Interesting. So like, let me just try to make, I guess, some other argument. So I see this, I mean, it's on the screen, 2 Corinthians 5. This is one people go to. I see this as he speaks of a house, the earthly house, kind of what you're talking about in 1 Corinthians 15 would parallel this. But, it says those that are Christ at his coming, for Christ the first fruits, and those that are his at his coming. So what is that coming, I guess, is what I'd want to know. It actually is what I'd ask you.
I believe his coming was 70 AD.
Okay, so
His
you're kind
coming
of
in
like,
judgment. He came to judge Israel. And in just like in the Old Testament, anytime God came to judge, it was by way of armies, by way of Babylon, by way of.
So I hope this Mark Stoney. So I hope that he'll watch this, because we're going to try to set up a time to have this conversation. This will help him understand my view. As I said, I'm not post-mill, I'm pre-mill, post-tribulation. Would be my interpretation of 2 Thessalonians 2. But regarding this, so the issue is, you're going to say the coming, and I kind of tried to lay this out. I'm not quite sure it seems like you kind of agree with this, and maybe kind of don't. But what would encompass the period of time that you would call the day of the Lord / his coming, as these sort of references, in 1 Corinthians 15, at his Christ, but each in his own order, Christ the first fruits, then those that are his at his coming. Obviously, you believe Matthew 27 fulfills the physical resurrection, if that's a necessary thing to be fulfilled, which it seems that you're saying, okay, you guys are pointing to verses that talk about the relationship of Jesus coming and the resurrection of dead people. That is, at least, although there's a spiritual aspect to the work of Christ through the Spirit, which is a resurrection of sorts that Paul talks about, it's also quite clear in every conceivable context of the relationship with those that are his having a physical resurrection, in the same way Jesus had a bodily resurrection, which seems to have great importance for various reasons, some of which people disagree with, but that what's clear in the text is the importance is of understanding a physical resurrection, because Jesus came in the flesh and rose physically, and the relationship between those at his coming who are raised. And you acknowledge that, and you apply Matthew 27, which there's people who come out of the graves. That's my understanding. But so what constitutes that which you can call his coming? Passages from the Old Testament which speak of the day of the Lord seem to have application to Jesus, what traditional Christianity calls his first coming, right? When he ratifies the covenant. And we see in like Luke 4, when he quotes, after being anointed with the Holy Spirit, God speaking from heaven, he begins his ministry, the beginning of the 70th week, of which he's cut off halfway through to bring the new covenant and call back the nations, of which terminates seemingly at 34 AD when Stephen is stoned, something like that at least. Then it goes to the Gentiles. That's how I understand it. The messianic interpretation of Daniel's 70th week seems like you'd agree. So what constitutes, in your view, the coming? Obviously, since you're applying all day of the Lord passages from the Old Testament, you understand a Christological interpretation of Old Testament prophecy, which I think is correct. That's what the New Testament writers do, after all, which falsifies dispensationalism, of course. But what constitutes that? Because it says Christ, the first fruits, and those that are his at his coming. You're saying the coming, you truncated kind of what I saw as options, what I think is reasonable options for your view would be, and you truncated it from the beginning of his ministry, which I actually think makes the most sense, to the destruction of the temple, which you hesitated earlier to necessarily call that period of those 40 years, which most preterists, as I understand that to be the same period of time in actual history, which is normally represented by Revelation 20 in the millennial period that people classically understand to be a literal 1,000 years. I'm not going to argue about why that doesn't make sense at all, like people do who aren't preterists. The point is, whether you do or you don't, it's when you see at his coming and you acknowledge which you seem to do, wanting to apply Matthew 27 to fulfill the physical actual resurrection that must occur to correlate to the verses as I just mentioned. But that problem with that is you also relate like what the destruction of the temple as being the end of the period of his first coming. That's included, right? Because many verses talk about the judgment, which you're applying to the destruction of Jerusalem. So I guess you're just kind of saying at his coming is just any time in the period between the destruction of the temple and the beginning of his ministry, or the beginning of his ministry to the destruction of the temple. That period, you could say, constitutes the spread of time in your view, which you could say is the day of the Lord, or / his coming, the ministry to the destruction. It's just like, because my point of all that is like, they're raised at his coming. When you look at 2 Thessalonians 2 and the way Paul talks about when people get our glorified body, it doesn't say it happens at death. The immortal body that's given comes to believers at the resurrection, which is associated with the coming of Jesus, which is called the blessed hope, which Jesus described as every eye seeing. And I don't know about you, but Jesus judges the entire earth seemingly on one day that's executed, per se Revelation 13:8 and what he teaches in Matthew 13. In other words, he can't judge all the nations which are separated until that day. So going to heaven or hell before you die in traditional Christianity, to me, is false, if that isn't clear. You don't go to heaven or hell when you die. It remains that you're in the grave until Jesus returns. That's why there's a resurrection from the dead. I mean, when you look at Matthew, so yes, Jesus rose people from the dead, but they didn't go on living forever after that. They died. It was a resuscitation, the scholarship will call it, or whatever, which is fine. I'm just saying. But the eternal life in the resurrection is going back to the state before death entered, which is why I referenced Genesis. In other words, you can call it a spiritual death, but the theology isn't in the text. And it's not that it's totally out of bounds, because that's part of interpretation that comes after exegesis, is that you have to apply the theological meaning and application to your exegesis, which establishes the foundation of the original intent of the author in its context, so that you extrapolate properly theology based on the principles demonstrated in the New Testament writers and what Jesus taught, which can give us kind of our boundaries or our basis for the theological part of the interpretation, which must come. So it just seems like when you put all Paul's statements together about the resurrection being at his coming and the relationship to it being a physical resurrection where dead bodies arise, I can appreciate that you see some necessity of that and want to apply Matthew 27, but then when you apply it as a whole theologically, it seems to fall short, because that isn't the kind of resurrection in Matthew 27 that he's talking about, that's entangled with all the teachings of Paul regarding this issue. And unfortunately, like I said from the very beginning, I think preterists are better studied, more honest oftentimes with the language, and they see all the nonsense in greater evangelical Christianity, and they go, you're like, equally, you would say like that's just should be dismissed, and then kind of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. But of course, now I'm talking exclusively like only my group has it right. Well, I do think my group has it right. And I think it's an understandable mistake to throw out all of premillennialism, because they seem so willing to just deny the things that preterists point out about the relationship to the language in the first covenant and to the destruction of Jerusalem. But I'm not denying those things. That's why I call myself a small p partial preterist, because I want to distinguish myself from these futurists who are clearly false in those things, but who I have other agreements with, like the nature of the resurrection, which, again, let me just reiterate, the entire Christian community historically, heretics and non-heretics, Catholic, non-Catholic, back to the Apostles' Creed, the earliest creed we have, developed the creeds we can establish that Paul developed, according to scholarship across the board, almost pretty much, and we know what they thought about resurrection and the distinctions, and what the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Essenes believed. And there's a lot of scholarship across the board with people who have different understandings of the nature of death and dualism and monism and holism. And I would just say, I think it's appropriate that you have the interpretations you do regarding the state of the dead and regarding hell, which gets you out of a lot of problems because to me, mostly, if a preterist believes in the traditional historical majority view of eternal conscious torment, that doesn't make any sense at all, because everything that's based on from the text is derived from the text, like Revelation, which is based off of the historical majority understanding of judgment, the last day of history, and the end of the world. But if you truncate all the verses into first century AD, on what basis are you going to propose this sort of metaphysical traditional view of eternal conscious torment? It makes absolutely no sense. You have nothing to stand on. In other words, you're borrowing from what everybody believed, right or wrong, and then undermining everything it's based on from the text by asserting that it's all has to do with the first century. But then you're like standing on the shoulders of ghosts because you've double tapped them, metaphorically speaking, regarding the doctrine based on the text. So anyways,
different armies that would conquer Israel, enslave them.
So do you think Paul thought, when Paul wrote this in 1 Corinthians 5, when he's in verse 6, he says, he's saying, look, we're groaning because we're waiting for not to be unclothed, which seems to make a category of there being this body, his mortal body, which
Right.
is destroyed. We have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this we groan earnestly, desiring to be clothed with our habitation, which is from heaven. It's obviously talking about seems to me to correlate with what Paul teaches elsewhere, where he says, this mortal must put in mortality, right? So so anybody who's watching this, just to understand that the person who I want to have, who I'm having this conversation with, and I'm kind of learning their view on the fly, and I'm replaying it, which I give at the introduction of replaying this video. I gave an introduction to my intention here, which is thinking out the implications of our discussion and a desire and our plan to talk again. So I'm making this as trying to make some differentiations to have a more productive conversation. And so I'm reflecting on it. So my point there, and this is the last point I'm going to make because I got to do some work. But if anybody's out there and they want to come, I saw one person. I'm going to do a live stream tonight. If you can come, that'd be great. I'll do an open stream. You can leave a message in here if you want to ask me something particular or you want to talk about something in particular. Let me know, and then I'll set it up in the permanent comment session, not the side chat, but the comment section once the video is uploaded when I'm done here in a minute. But so my point is regarding Mark's position, and I'll try to establish this more solidly from the text if and when we talk. But the point I was kind of seeing and trying to make is that you're kind of half acknowledging the necessity of there being a literal physical resurrection in the way that Jesus physically rose bodily by applying Matthew 27. But which one should we apply this way of thinking to that sort of doctrinal understanding regarding the resurrection, its nature, etc., from this text here, which is clearly part of understanding it from the text? What sort of resurrection here is he referring to what happened in Matthew 27? And I don't know, do you think the people who were resurrected in order to fulfill that necessity of the text regarding the nature of the resurrection and its relationship to Christ's resurrection, did they go on living forever? Never to see death again? Were they glorified? Or were they like Lazarus? What is the distinction there on your view? In other words, if we're deriving our doctrine of the nature of the resurrection from what we get from Paul and the rest of the text, and you acknowledge that on some level we need to have some sort of fulfillment to be consistent, like on your view, so you relate Matthew 27 to that, seeing that necessity, assumingly, seems like that's the case, which is trying to make sense of the text and not ignoring things, which I appreciate. But it's like, what does that tell us about the nature of the resurrection, which is in view, which is like Jesus, and the idea about being glorified and this mortal putting on immortality? In other words, while trying to incorporate the necessity of that physical resurrection by bringing in Matthew 27, seems like you're basically having to compartmentalize what this is talking about, which in fact isn't a physical resurrection in any sense. Then the question is, how do you establish that regarding how we receive doctrine from these documents as they were, as we interpret them to the church as a whole over time, having established its meaning from its original context to a particular church in a particular circumstance, right? Like we obviously have to say, well, the book of Romans, you could say was just to the Romans. That's not to you. So you can't extrapolate anything from it. But of course, the history of exegesis to the people of God, which was clearly the intention, while at the same time having an original context in this particular circumstances, which is what we established to get our theology from. Well, on what basis can you separate, presuming you have that understanding that I just described as being obviously necessary on the appropriate interpretation of the Bible, is being just foundationally the case? And I presume you do, because your preterists are usually smart enough to understand that and why other views have bad foundations. The thing is, I don't see any way for you to establish that separation. Yet I see you acknowledging the necessity to make sense of the text by bringing in Matthew 27 as a fulfillment of those things I keep describing, and I won't do it again. How do you separate these two? On what basis? That would be a big question I have, that I think maybe exposes the problems with your view. In other words, to be just straight up with you, I can look, I'm so tempted, and I have and did appeal to it, that everybody believed this. That doesn't mean that something isn't wrong. I mean, I think eternal conscious torment, which is vastly takes up the most minds over time in Christian history, but I would actually argue that the earliest Christians, like Polycarp, Ignatius, Clement of Rome, were not eternal conscious torment people. I think they were annihilationists, as it were, anachronistically or whatever. I would even suggest that they perhaps were not dualists, but who cares? Depends on what you mean by dualist anyway. My point is, I would say earlier church fathers have more weight than twice as many church fathers that come 300 years later, even though there's twice as many, because these guys knew the apostles. But even so, the text has all the weight. And so I can't say that just if you're getting it from the text, I can't say you're wrong because all the church fathers were wrong. But it's nice to have somebody who asserts your view. And it seems to be true that the preterist view denies what almost everybody agreed on, which is in the creeds. How do you deal with that? I mean, because if you take that properly, the weight of that properly, it's not, I'm not a Catholic, I'm a Protestant, so I would say there's really no historical view outside of scripture that can overwhelm an interpretation as long as it can be derived from the text, consistently or whatever. But if everybody disagrees with you in church history and you have nothing, and what everybody agrees on connects directly to the apostles with no breaks in it, seemingly, that seems problematic. It doesn't end the debate, but that has to be explained. Jesus promised the truth wouldn't die, but everybody saw it. I mean, I guess you could say some people probably didn't comment on it, so you could speculate, but I'm sure I could find people that were maybe who claimed those sorts of things and everybody rejected them as a heretic. Now, I'm not interested in really calling you a heretic in so much as that I just still see that as a major issue without some sort of explanation. Seems like something that remains to be explained, how that could happen. What's the pedigree of this belief? Or what is the cause that caused such a vast majority over various persuasions of Christianity to never believe that truth? Especially since we even know what Jews were saying during Jesus' time and what Jesus taught and things like that regarding the nature of the resurrection and the end of the world. And yes, I understand that certain aspects they didn't understand what the globe was, and I agree with you, they didn't know what the globe was. But I would just say this, in 2 Peter, Peter's preaching this: the same world that was created out of water, which I think is an interpretation of Genesis, but he seems to believe that. In Genesis, so when he's describing the destruction of the flood and he's thinking of the text, he's saying, look, people are going to deny the flood, which he teaches in 1 Peter is the evidence, the fact of the flood and that people died in it proves God is going to judge the world. And this evidence is so that men today will understand there is a coming judgment. Jesus is that judge, so that they will turn from their evil, seeing this evidence that God judges, and walk in the Spirit. Now, I understand your view is like a very truncated version of mine, so I'm going to be stuck in my paradigm to some degree, and I'm going to think, do you really think that's all to be truncated between when Peter wrote that till the destruction of the temple? I mean, I see this sort of thinking in the world historically as we preach the gospel of the coming judgments of God, and Jesus is that judge. And he said, the same world that was created out of water, reference to the text of Genesis, was overflowed with water. The same world then is reserved for fire and the judgment of ungodly men. And Jesus is that judge. And then scoffers will deny this flood. But it's like, is he wanting to say that only applies to the Jewish non-believing nation? Or was the plan of God, when we look now back up, here's another objection to your view, because you're going to kind of have like a narrowed focus on Israel as the people of God. And you're still saying, like I do, that God blew it wide open for all nations, and the non-believing Jews rejected Jesus, and so that's who he's condemning. But what is really the issue of mankind? We're the only bad. I'm not saying you're anti-Semitic. I don't. People make all sorts of stupid arguments like that. The point is, the root issue at the beginning of Romans is a human issue, and he's pulling that into the context of what's happening in Israel. So like Israel's like this, what's happening in the first century is a microcosm of what? The actual condition of humankind as a whole, going back to Genesis, which is what Peter references too. So God is the creator of the whole world and all of humans. Surely he's going to eventually bring this kingdom of Satan, which still has baby rape and murder and sin next door, or maybe even in the very house you're sitting in the very room, in fact, the very chair. Now we can just say we're all redeemed because Jesus died, and I believe that. But there's work still being done, and God has promised to say, this what I have made will be back to how it was in the beginning, which was this planet, this earth. This can't be the new heavens and the new earth because my grandma's still dead. Thank you very much. And when on the day things are restored fully, the whole world, which Christ will judge the hearts of men, humans, is a day. And that hasn't happened yet.